January 5, 2026. The room is silent except for the low hum of air conditioning and the soft click of a pen against polished wood. Outside the White House windows, Washington is frozen under a pale winter sky. Inside, advisors lean forward. Phones vibrate. Screens glow. Somewhere between the smell of stale coffee and printer ink, a single question hangs in the air. What comes next? No announcement has been made. No orders signed, but the machinery is already moving. Power never shifts loudly at first. It shifts in pauses. In glances. In meetings that end 5 minutes early. And in this moment, after Venezuela, the world is listening for the next sound. To understand what might come next, you have to step away from headlines and return to patterns. Not promises. Not speeches. Patterns. Donald Trump's approach to foreign pressure has never followed traditional diplomatic choreography. It relies instead on leverage, visibility, and systems. During his first term, pressure was rarely applied evenly. It was focused. Targeted. Designed to collapse weak points rather than confront entire nations head-on. This is not new. It is an old strategy wearing modern language. During the Cold War, the United States learned that direct confrontation often produced stalemate. But pressure applied to infrastructure, logistics, and political support networks could achieve results without firing a shot. Energy supply. Financial access. Intelligence exposure. Maritime control. These were the quiet battlegrounds. Trump has consistently favored these tools. In public, he speaks in blunt terms. Privately, his policy record shows something more specific: pressure without ownership. The goal is not occupation. Not rebuilding. Not long wars. The goal is to force decisions, fast ones, by making existing systems too expensive to maintain. Venezuela was not targeted because it was strong. It was targeted because it was fragile. Its economy was already hollow. Its energy infrastructure dependent. Its survival tied to external support. Remove one pillar, and the structure begins to lean. Remove two, and it cracks. That context matters, because whatever comes next will likely follow the same logic. Back in Washington, analysts are not asking who Trump dislikes. They are asking which systems can be stressed without triggering global escalation. That narrows the field dramatically. Modern American power projection no longer begins with troops. It begins with mapping dependencies. Where does fuel come from? Who insures the ships? Which cables carry data? Which banks clear payments? Which allies quietly keep the lights on? These questions define modern targets, and that is why the next focus, if it comes, will likely not resemble a traditional conflict at all. Meanwhile, beyond Washington, other capitals are running their own calculations. In Havana, rolling blackouts already shape daily life. In Bogotá, border intelligence reports grow thicker by the week. In Brussels, diplomats scan speeches for omissions rather than threats. Silence, in this phase, is often more revealing than words. The United States has applied this kind of pressure before. Against Iran, through layered sanctions. Against Cuba, through decades of economic isolation. Against Russia, through financial and energy constraints. The lesson repeated itself every time: systems crack long before governments fall. Trump's political instinct amplifies this lesson. He favors moves that are visible enough to signal strength, yet limited enough to avoid long-term entanglement. It is a businessman's logic applied to statecraft. Increase cost. Reduce options. Force negotiation, or collapse. But there is risk here. Pressure creates reaction. Systems adapt. Allies hesitate. Adversaries probe for weakness elsewhere. And history shows that once pressure begins, stopping it without visible results becomes politically difficult, which is why the next step, if taken, will matter more than the last, because Venezuela was not an endpoint. It was a test case. A test of how far pressure alone can go. A test of how quickly systems fail when support is removed. A test of how the world responds when power is applied indirectly, but unapologetically. And now the test has produced results, ambiguous, incomplete, and dangerous. Back in Washington, the meetings continue. Maps are updated. Briefings refined. No country is named publicly. No announcement is made. But the logic is already locked in. If pressure worked once, why stop now? And the real question becomes not who is next, but which system can survive being squeezed. Because somewhere, right now, another fragile structure is being measured. Quietly. Methodically, and it may already be under more strain than anyone realizes. January 6, 2026. Dawn breaks unevenly across the Caribbean. In Havana, the power flickers back on just long enough to restart a ceiling fan before cutting out again. The air is heavy, unmoving. Diesel generators cough into life somewhere down the block, filling the streets with the sharp smell of fuel and metal. Far from Washington, far from microphones, pressure is already being felt in small, physical ways. This is how modern power announces itself now. Not with columns of armor. Not with declarations of war. But with interruptions. Delays. Shortages that turn daily routines into calculations. To understand what may come next, you have to follow the chain reactions that began long before Venezuela made headlines. For decades, certain states survived not because they were self-sufficient, but because they were plugged into support systems. Energy swaps. Intelligence sharing. Financial workarounds. Political shielding at international forums. These arrangements were fragile, but they worked as long as no one pulled too hard. Venezuela was one such node. Cuba was another. And between them ran a network of oil shipments, technical advisors, intelligence coordination, and economic dependency that few outside intelligence circles paid attention to. When Venezuela's output declined, Cuba felt it first. Power plants slowed. Fuel rationing increased. Transportation suffered. These weren't theoretical consequences. They were measurable, documented, and reported by international monitoring agencies and humanitarian organizations long before any new political pressure entered the picture. This is why analysts increasingly focus not on speeches, but on spreadsheets, energy imports, shipping insurance, refinery maintenance schedules. These are the fault lines of modern states. In Trump's first term, similar logic guided policy decisions. Sanctions were designed not just to punish, but to expose dependency. Iranian oil exports. Russian access to dollar clearing. Chinese reliance on specific supply chains. Each move was calibrated to create internal pressure without immediate confrontation. Critics called it chaotic. Supporters called it leverage, but regardless of interpretation, the pattern was consistent. Identify a system that cannot function alone, then apply stress where adaptation is slowest. Cuba fits that pattern precisely. Its electrical grid is outdated. Its fuel supply is limited. Its economy relies heavily on tourism, remittances, and external energy arrangements. These facts are not controversial. They are documented by international energy agencies, academic studies, and Cuban state acknowledgments themselves. Pressure here does not require a single dramatic action. It requires persistence. Meanwhile, across the water, regional dynamics complicate the picture. Colombia's borders with Venezuela stretch across dense terrain where state control has always been partial. Smuggling routes shift constantly. Armed groups operate in gray zones. These are not new phenomena. But they become more significant when central governments weaken. From a strategic perspective, these areas are not targets in the traditional sense. They are pressure amplifiers. Disruptions here ripple outward, affecting trade, migration, and security calculations across the region. This is where modern geopolitics becomes quiet and uncomfortable. Because no single action crosses the threshold of war. But the cumulative effect is undeniable. Ships are delayed. Payments are blocked. Fuel arrives late or not at all. Maintenance is deferred. Systems degrade, and degradation creates fear. Fear among civilians uncertain when the lights will come back on. Fear among officials who can no longer guarantee stability. Fear among allies who wonder whether association now carries risk. Back in Washington, this fear is measured carefully. Not emotionally. Practically, how much pressure produces movement, how much produces backlash, how much before adaptation outpaces enforcement. These questions dominate internal debates far more than moral arguments or public rhetoric. History offers lessons here. In the 1980s, pressure on energy markets contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union's economic viability. In the 1990s, sanctions reshaped Iraq's internal dynamics with devastating humanitarian consequences. In each case, the tools worked, but not cleanly. Trump's critics often point to these examples as warnings. His supporters point to them as proof of effectiveness. What is different now is speed. Global systems move faster. Markets react instantly. Information spreads without control. A decision in Washington can affect fuel prices, shipping insurance, and currency stability within hours. That acceleration increases both leverage and risk creates uncertainty. the one thing markets and governments fear most. Somewhere in this uncertainty lies the next decision, not a declaration, not an invasion, but a choice about where pressure can be applied with maximum effect and minimal blowback. Cuba's name surfaces often in these discussions, not because of ideology, but because of math. Energy balances. Import ratios. Infrastructure age. These numbers tell a story more persuasive than any speech, and yet, numbers alone do not decide policy. Politics matters. Optics matter. Timing matters. Domestic audiences respond differently to different targets. Allies react based on history and proximity. Adversaries test resolve through small provocations. Every move creates ripples far beyond its immediate scope. That is why silence, at this stage, is deliberate. No one wants to announce pressure before the systems begin to strain. Because once named, a target adapts faster. So instead, the world watches indicators, fuel shipments, grid outages, currency reserves, border activity. Each fluctuation is noted, logged, compared, and behind closed doors, one uncomfortable realization grows clearer. Pressure, once applied, is difficult to reverse without visible results. Backing down looks like weakness. Escalating invites consequences. Holding steady demands patience, and patience is rare in modern politics, which raises a troubling question. If the next move is not about conquest, not about war, but about endurance, which system is already closest to the breaking point? Because in modern geopolitics, the first collapse rarely happens where cameras are pointed. It happens quietly. In the dark. January 7, 2026. Night settles over Washington again. The city glows softly, monuments lit from below, streets wet with melting snow. Inside government buildings, lights stay on long after offices should be empty. Papers move from hand to hand. Screens refresh. Somewhere, a decision is being delayed, not because leaders don't know what they can do, but because they know exactly what doing it would mean. This is the moment where speculation turns inward. Do Donald Trump and Washington want to attack Cuba? Do they want to overrule the Americas, or even the world? The short answer, supported by history and record, is no. Not in the way the word attack suggests. Not with troops landing on beaches. Not with missiles falling on cities. And not with the ambition to rule the hemisphere or dominate the globe through force. But the longer answer is more complicated. And more uncomfortable, because power in the modern era rarely looks like conquest. It looks like control of options. Since the end of World War II, the United States has never sought to govern the world directly. Instead, it has worked, sometimes clumsily, sometimes brutally, to shape the environment in which others must operate. Alliances. Trade systems. Energy markets. Financial networks. These are the levers of influence, and they matter far more than flags planted on foreign soil. Cuba sits at a strange intersection of this system. For more than 60 years, it has existed in partial isolation, surviving through external support, ideological alignment, and adaptation. The United States has pressured it before. Extensively. Yet Cuba endured, in part because the global system was slower, less interconnected, and more forgiving of inefficiency. That world no longer exists. Today, energy flows are tighter. Financial compliance is stricter. Shipping insurance is centralized. Technology is unforgiving. Small disruptions cascade quickly. And this changes how pressure works. From Washington's perspective, Cuba is not a military problem. It poses no conventional threat. It fields no forces capable of challenging the United States or its allies. There is no strategic incentive for war. What Cuba represents instead is a systemic vulnerability, a place where pressure can be applied with limited escalation risk and high symbolic value. That distinction matters. Trump's record supports this interpretation. During his presidency, he repeatedly avoided large-scale military engagements. He withdrew forces where possible. He favored sanctions, tariffs, and diplomatic pressure. Even when military force was used, it was limited, framed as deterrence rather than occupation. This does not make his approach gentle. It makes it transactional. In this framework, Cuba is not a target to be conquered. It is a signal. A reminder of what happens when systems depend too heavily on external support and lack resilience, and this is where fears about overruling the Americas or dominating the world often arise, because pressure, when successful, can look like control from the outside, but control is not the same as governance. The United States cannot run Cuba's power plants. It cannot manage its economy. It cannot dictate its internal politics without consequences. What it can do is influence the environment in which Cuban leaders must make decisions. That influence has limits. History is full of examples where pressure hardened resistance instead of breaking it. Cuba itself is one of them. Sanctions did not topple its government. Isolation did not produce rapid reform. Adaptation kept the system alive. If strained, this is the risk Washington faces now. Pressure that goes too far creates backlash. Humanitarian suffering draws international condemnation. Allies become uncomfortable. Adversaries exploit narratives of imperialism. The very systems meant to enforce pressure can fracture under moral and political strain. That is why every option on the table is narrower than it appears. Trump and Washington want to attack Cuba. No. They want to reshape behavior without owning the consequences. Possibly. They want to rule the Americas or the world. History suggests something more limited and more cynical. They want leverage over migration flows, leverage over regional stability, leverage over adversarial networks that rely on fragile states. Leverage is not permanent. It must be renewed constantly. And it works only as long as others believe it can be sustained. That belief is now being tested. In Havana, leaders calculate how much strain their system can absorb. In Latin America, governments watch closely, aware that pressure applied to one state can easily spill into others. In Europe, diplomats debate how far alignment with Washington should go when economic and humanitarian concerns collide, and in the United States, the political clock keeps ticking. Pressure strategies are slow. They rarely deliver dramatic moments. Their success is measured in trends, not victories. That makes them vulnerable to impatience, especially in an era of constant media and instant judgment, which brings everything back to that quiet room in Washington, because the most important decision is not whether to apply pressure, but whether to stay the course once the costs become visible. If Cuba bends, the strategy looks effective. If it holds, the pressure must either escalate or end, and escalation, even without bombs or troops, always carries consequences that cannot be fully controlled. This is the uncomfortable truth behind the question of what's next. The United States does not need to rule the world to shape it, but shaping the world always changes the one doing the shaping, and as pressure builds quietly, invisibly, the final uncertainty remains, not whether Cuba can endure but whether Washington can live with the results, whatever they turn out to be, because once systems are pushed to their limits, there is no clean way to pull back. And the world will remember not the intentions, but the outcomes.